You are standing on a mountain pass, higher than the clouds, and you are freezing. It's late autumn in the year 218 before our era, and the wind coming off the peaks of the Alps cuts through your cloak like it isn't there. You are a soldier from Africa, a cavalryman from the plains of Numidia in what is now Algeria, and you are further from home than you have ever been. Below you, through a gap in the mist, you can finally see it. The green valley of Italy, the richest prize on earth, the homeland of Rome itself. Behind you on the frozen path, an army from Africa is climbing, tens of thousands of men, horses, mules. And then you hear it. A sound that has no business existing on a snowfield 2 miles into the sky. A trumpeting bellow echoing off the rock. You turn, and through the falling snow you watch a war elephant, an African war elephant, placing its feet, one by one, on the ice of Europe's tallest mountains. And at the head of this impossible column rides a man in his 20s who is about to become the most feared human being in the Roman world. His name is Hannibal Barca. He comes from Carthage on the coast of North Africa. And he is going to bring the greatest empire in history to its knees. Rome never forgot him. Centuries after his death, when Roman children misbehaved, their mothers frightened them with a phrase that had become a national reflex. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. Think about that. The most powerful state on the planet used one African man's name as its word for terror, for generations. And yet somehow, in the version of history most of us were handed, Hannibal gets filed under ancient Rome. A supporting character in somebody else's story, his African-ness quietly airbrushed away. Today, we put the story back where it belongs. So here's the question that should amaze you. How did a general from Africa, from a city the Romans swore to destroy, march an army, with elephants, over the Alps, spend more than 15 years undefeated on Rome's own soil, and hand Rome the bloodiest single day of battle it would suffer for the next 2,000 years? And why does the continent he came from so rarely get the credit? Let's get into it. Start with the city, because the city explains the man. Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, a great harbor city of sailors, merchants, and engineers. It had been founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers from the eastern Mediterranean, and it grew by weaving itself into Africa. Its farms were African, its soldiers were drawn from across North Africa, its bloodlines mixed Phoenician and Libyan and Berber, and its wealth came from trading networks that ran deep into the continent as well as across the sea. By Hannibal's time, Carthage was the superpower of the western Mediterranean, so rich, so commercially dominant, that a rising Rome could not tolerate sharing a sea with it. The two fought a first great war for 23 years. Carthage lost, and the loss came with humiliation. Territory stripped, crushing payments imposed. Hannibal's father, the general Hannibal Barca, carried that humiliation like a wound that would not close. There is a story the ancient historians tell, that when Hannibal was about 9 years old, his father took him to an altar, placed the boy's hand on the sacrifice, and made him swear an oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, Hannibal lived as if it had. He grew up in an army camp in Spain, where Carthage was building a new empire to replace what it had lost. He learned war the way other children learn a family trade: logistics, terrain, horses, men, languages. The soldiers loved him. The ancient sources say he ate what they ate, slept on the ground among them wrapped in a plain cloak, was first into danger and last out of it. By the age of 26, he commanded all of Carthage's forces in Spain. And when the next war with Rome came, over a besieged city called Saguntum, Hannibal made a decision so audacious that no one in Rome believed it even as it was happening. Rome ruled the sea, so Hannibal wouldn't cross the sea. He would walk. Walk from Spain, across the Pyrenees, across the great rivers of Gaul, over the Alps themselves, and down into Italy's back garden. No army from the south had ever done it. The mountains were held to be a wall built by the gods. He set out with somewhere around 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Most of them African forest elephants, animals that no Roman soldier waiting in Italy had ever seen in his life. The crossing has become legend, but strip the legend away and the documented reality is harder to believe, not easier. He got an army with elephants across the Rhone River on giant rafts covered in earth so the animals would think they were still on land. He fought off ambushes from mountain tribes who rolled boulders down onto the column. He crossed the high passes in the first snows of winter, men freezing, mules sliding off cliffs, the path at one point so completely blocked by fallen rock that the ancient sources describe his engineers heating the boulders with fire and cracking them apart with sour wine and vinegar, carving a road out of the mountainside by hand. The crossing cost him nearly half his army. Perhaps 26,000 men came down into Italy. It did not matter. What came down out of those mountains was no longer just an army. It was a legend with a general at the front. And Rome's nightmare had begun. What happened over the next 3 years should be impossible. Military historians still teach it, move by move, at war colleges on every continent, including the academies of the very countries that once wrote Africa out of the story. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured a Roman army across freezing water at dawn, straight onto ground he had chosen, with a hidden force waiting in the reeds. The Roman army was shattered. At Lake Trasimene the following spring, he pulled off something that is still described as the largest ambush in military history. An entire Roman army, tens of thousands of men, marched in column into a fog-covered corridor between the hills and the lake, and discovered too late that Hannibal's whole force was on the slopes above them. In a few hours it was over. A Roman consul was dead. Rome had lost 2 armies in 2 years, on its own soil, to a man they kept insisting was a barbarian from Africa. And then came Cannae. In the summer of 216, Rome decided to end it. It assembled the largest army in its entire history. The ancient sources say around 80,000 men, 8 legions, both consuls, the cream of the Roman aristocracy in the officer corps. Hannibal met them on an open plain in southern Italy with perhaps 50,000, his veteran Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and the superb Numidian horsemen of North Africa, the finest light cavalry on the planet. What he did next is, to this day, the most studied battle plan in the history of warfare. He placed his weakest troops in the center and deliberately let the enormous Roman mass push them backward, the line bending like a bow, while his African veterans stood waiting on the wings and his cavalry destroyed their Roman counterparts and swung around the rear. The bending center held. The trap closed. 8 legions walked into a pocket, were sealed inside by a smaller army, and were annihilated. The ancient historians say somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon, one of the deadliest days any army has suffered in one battle, anywhere, in all of recorded history, ancient or modern. The Roman Senate received survivors' reports of an army that no longer existed. A double envelopment by an outnumbered force. Soldiers still call it a Cannae when anyone manages it. Almost no one ever has. For a moment, sit with the picture. An African general on European soil, with an army built around African soldiers and African cavalry, had just destroyed the largest force Rome ever fielded, and he had now been undefeated in Italy for 3 years. He would stay in Italy, undefeated in every major engagement, for more than 15. Rome stopped fighting him directly. It invented a whole new strategy, shadowing him, starving him, refusing battle, because battle with Hannibal meant destruction. The general Fabius, who designed that strategy of avoidance, was mocked as the delayer until Rome realized that delaying was the only thing keeping it alive. Now, this channel has a rule. We don't clean history up, because the astonishing stuff is only worth telling if it's true. So let's be honest about two things. First, what did Hannibal look like? The truthful answer is that nobody can tell you with certainty. Carthage was a North African city of mixed Phoenician and native African descent, and the surviving coin portraits are stylized. If someone tells you Hannibal definitely looked like this or that, they are selling something. What is beyond dispute is this. He was born in Africa, raised by Africa, and he fought with Africa. His infantry corps was African. His irreplaceable cavalry were Numidian Berbers, his elephants were African elephants, and his cause was an African city's survival. Second, Carthage was no gentle victim. It was an empire, too. It conquered, it enslaved, it fought its own brutal wars. This is not a story of innocence. It is a story about who gets remembered as a genius and who gets quietly reclassified out of their own continent. Because here is the ending Rome wrote. Unable to beat Hannibal in Italy, Rome finally attacked Carthage itself, forcing him home after a decade and a half. At Zama, in North Africa, in 202, Hannibal lost, for the first and only time in a pitched battle, to a young Roman named Scipio, who won largely by copying Hannibal's own methods and by hiring away the Numidian cavalry that had made him unstoppable. Even his defeat was a kind of tribute. The only general who ever beat Hannibal was, in a sense, Hannibal's own student. Afterward, Hannibal did something remarkable. He took off the armor and became a statesman, reforming Carthage's corrupt finances so effectively that the city recovered, which frightened Rome more than his elephants had. They hounded him across the Mediterranean, from court to court, demanding his surrender wherever he sheltered, until, as an old man in his 60s, cornered at last in a small kingdom by the Black Sea with Roman agents at the door, he drank the poison he had carried for years in a ring. His reported last words were a final act of contempt. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too tedious to wait for an old man's death. Rome outlived him, and Rome wrote the books. 50 years after Zama, it burned Carthage to the ground anyway. And then it did something that should make you sit up. When Rome turned Carthage's homeland into a province, it named that province after the people who lived there. The Roman name was Africa. That is where the continent's name comes from. The word Africa entered the world's vocabulary as the name of Carthage's country. The continent is, in the most literal sense, named for Hannibal's homeland. And yet we grew up being taught to think of his story as Roman history, as Mediterranean history, as anything but what it plainly is: African history. The greatest military mind of the ancient world, the man Napoleon and 100 generals since have ranked above themselves, was a son of Africa, leading Africans, remembered in the nightmares of Europe for 700 years. So go back, one last time, to that frozen pass above Italy. The wind is screaming. The elephant plants its feet on the ice and moves forward. The young general rides the column, calling men by name, pointing down through the clouds at the warm green country below, and telling them, in the words the historians preserved, "Beyond those fields lies Rome. After the mountains, everything else is downhill." He was right. Everything that came after, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, 15 unbeaten years, the name that frightened Roman children in their beds. All of it started with an African who looked at the tallest wall in Europe and decided it was a door. They named a continent after his homeland, story lovers. The least we can do is remember which continent he fought for. And now you do.